Morning, everybody. Let everybody filter in. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the Central Carolina Area Agency on Aging June webinar. Today we're going to be covering blowing the whistle on elder abuse. Our next slide is just some of our Zoom webinar features. So everybody, you are automatically muted. You cannot see other participants, but you will be able to see me and Lori. If you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. And so we are recording today. That'll be posted on our website. I know people love to get certificates of attendance as well. So give us about a week and you'll get a follow-up email with a certificate of attendance, recording of the webinar, a little survey. So that'll all be coming your way. All right, so our speaker today, as you can see, the lovely Lori Abinader, my counterpart here at Central Carolina Area Agency on Aging. And I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to her.
All right. Thank you, Caitlin, and thanks everyone for being here. I appreciate having the opportunity to share information with you about elder abuse. And I always applaud any audience who comes to listen to an elder abuse presentation, whether it be virtual or in person, because elder abuse is not something that we like to talk about. We don't enjoy this topic generally. So anytime someone makes an effort to go out of their comfort zone to learn about something that's not pretty, or uncomfortable, I always want to stop and acknowledge that and make a point to think, you know, it's not a pretty or sexy topic for sure, but we do need to know about it, especially those of us who work in the field of aging, or we have older relatives, or even if we just want to know for our own personal information. So today we're going to be doing a review of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Those are the three main tenets of elder abuse or elder mistreatment. You'll hear me use those words kind of interchangeably. And we're going to go ahead and jump into it. I have a lot of slides today. Those will be available to you, I believe. Caitlin, we can make that available on the website. I'm pretty sure we've done that before. So these are absolutely available to you, and our information is on there if you have questions. Of course, today, if you have questions, put them in the chat, like Caitlin mentioned. And in the future, if you have questions, our 800 number is on all of our information on our website. So you're always welcome to follow up with us with questions in the future. All righty. Session goals today. I'm not going to insult you by reading these. Couple of things we're going to touch on is elder abuse legislation and the history, understanding different forms of abuse and some of their indicators, risk factors, have an increased awareness of abuse, and know what to do if you suspect elder abuse. And let me jump back up to that increased awareness of abuse. And just pause a minute and mention that we are right now in the middle of Elder Abuse Awareness Month in North Carolina. North Carolina designated Elder Abuse Month from Mother's Day to Father's Day. And there's a reason they picked those two dates, because when we think of our older adults and those who are beloved, those are the folks, you know, Mother's Day to Father's Day, and elder abuse falls right in between those two dates, or elder abuse awareness. So I think it's fitting. World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, which we might talk about a little bit today. World Elder Abuse Awareness Day has been happening for some time now, and it's gotten much more popular. And you'll see elder abuse awareness walks, or people at an agency or a nursing home maybe wearing purple shirts in honor of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, just to make sure that folks bring their attention to it. And that's why we picked this month as our topic for our webinar, because of World Elder Abuse Awareness Month. So just wanted to add that little tidbit there. Okay, so we're going to jump into this and talk about why it's important to know about elder abuse. And elder abuse is horribly underreported and under-researched, and it's because it's very much a hidden problem. The iceberg is the best visual. When I saw this I saw this very same slide about probably 20 years ago. It absolutely hit me in the face how much we need to do, how much work we need to do in our society on elder abuse awareness. So the typical fact or factoid that we hear about is that for one case of elder abuse that gets reported to a responsible entity, which would be law enforcement or adult protective services, that another 23 cases never come to light, just like that hidden iceberg. You can see that it's, you know, the huge amount of that iceberg is hidden. And that's the same, you know, for the elder abuse that we do hear about. Just know that we're not hearing about nearly as much as what is actually happening. It's very much a hidden problem. And we'll talk about some of those reasons as we go along today. Okay, let's jump into give you a little bit of perspective as far as like the history. So in our nation in 1974, we started hearing about efforts to keep children safe, which I'm completely in favor of course. So 1974, we had child abuse prevention efforts, and then there was more with the Keeping Children and Families Safe in 2003. So there's been a lot of legislation about that, starting way back in 1974. 1994, we started hearing more and more about violence against women. And now we hear domestic violence. Actually, we hear a new term, which is called intimate partner violence, which takes account that it's not always women who are the victims of violence, that it could be a male, it could be a different partners, it can be same-sex partners, it can be all sorts. Well, I don't mean all sorts, but it's not just limited to women, I guess is the easiest and best way I should have explained that. But that legislation started in 1994. Not until 2010 did we hear federal legislation in the United States. And what's important to note is that the Elder Justice Act, which is what finally did pass in 2010, it was introduced in Congress in 2006, and it went before the Congress. You can see there the 107th, the 108th, all the way up to the 110th Congress in 2010. So it went before Congress for 5 years before it finally got passed and signed into law, which may be a reflection of more than just elder abuse. But I think it's important to notice that we are, 40 years behind in our elder abuse efforts. We're about 40 years behind children, and we're about 20 years behind intimate partner violence or violence against women. So just keep that in the back of your mind there. So funding for the Elder Justice Act, when the act was first passed in 2010, it authorized $777 million over 4 years. But there was no funding that went with it. No funding was allocated by the Congress. The same group in Congress who had trouble getting it passed also didn't allocate any funds to it until 2015. And when that happened, it was only $5 million. So a drop in the bucket compared to what was originally authorized. The Elder Justice and Reauthorization and Modernization Act, it's a mouthful, which was 2023. So that is taking the 2010 Act and modernizing it, bringing it up to speed, and adding in the things that they had been working on since 2010. They appropriated 4.5 billion for new and existing Elder Justice Act programs. So the way that we see that is additional funding for adult protective service programs, or for research, or for support for elder abuse multidisciplinary teams, coming down from the federal level to the state level to the regional level and the local level. So that's the way that we're probably seeing that the most, as well as research and trying to do things more streamlined, to make sure that we are able to collect data and have that data. Like we were saying earlier, it's an under-researched problem. So we definitely are making progress. It's just slow progress, and we are well behind child abuse and domestic violence efforts. The Elder Justice Act is significant because it's the first federal legislation, and it's very comprehensive to address abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So states, all the 50 states already had different laws in place for elder abuse, but we didn't have anything comprehensive from a federal level. So the idea behind that act is that we're coordinating federal responses, doing more research, innovation, and providing additional protections for individuals who live in communities as well as who live in long-term care facilities. Okay. Moving forward, let's talk about the costs of elder abuse. Now, as you might imagine, with elder abuse being as underreported and hidden as it is, we don't really have the facts and figures to say definitively how much elder abuse is costing us. So keep that in mind. These are estimates at best, but it's important to think through the different ways that elder abuse has consequences and costs to us. One is the trauma that happens from abuse. It can lead to, of course, deteriorated health, hospitalizations, and even death. It does increase mortality rates. Elders who have been abused, even what we call modest abuse, although I say that and it's hard to say modest abuse and let that roll off your tongue, leaves kind of a bitter taste. But elders who have been abused have a 300% higher risk of death compared to those who have not been mistreated. Cost estimates, like how much it costs us as a nation, the cost estimates of elder financial abuse, they vary greatly, anywhere from $2.6 billion per year all the way up to $35 billion per year. And the biggest part of where this varies is whether or not you're considering financial exploitation of an individual by other individuals versus including scams and fraud and identity theft and things like that. I think that's what drives up that other up to that 35 billion. And both of those sources are listed there if you wanted to read more. The TrueLink financial abuse report, it's I want to say it was 2015. I'm not really sure off the top of my head, but it was really eye-opening when it came out. It was kind of like a hot topic, and it went everywhere. It spread very rapidly throughout the elder abuse research community because that is such an outstanding big number, and trying to figure out where that number came from versus the 2.6 billion that we had been using all the way up until that. Seniors who receive just one telemarketing call per day are likely to experience 3 times as much financial loss as someone who receives only occasional telemarketing calls. It is also estimated that 954,000 seniors currently skip meals as a result of their financial abuse and financial situation. And lastly, violent injury to elders as a result of abuse is estimated to add $5.3 billion to our nation's annual health expenses. Oh, and there is the TrueLink report with the date on it. I thought that was there. It was just on a different slide, but it's the 2015 TrueLink report is the source there for these figures. Okay, let's do a quick definition of elder abuse. The Elder Justice Act defines elder abuse as the knowing infliction of physical or psychological harm, or the knowing deprivation of goods or services that are necessary to meet essential needs. Then the international, this is the group that it originally started the World Elder Abuse Awareness Efforts, the International Network Prevention Elder Abuse. Their definition, elder abuse is a single or repeated act or lack of action occurring with any relationship where there's an expectation of trust, which causes harm or distress to an older person. So those are pretty similar, and they've got some similar themes running through there, talking about the known infliction, and talking about the expectation of trust if there's a caregiver involved. And we'll talk a little bit more about both of those. Okay, so I think I mentioned earlier, elder abuse is an umbrella term. It gets confusing, so I have always used this to explain. We talk about abuse in two ways. Abuse or elder abuse is the overall arching term for abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And then abuse is also one of the subcategories of abuse. So you've got abuse, and then you've got abuse as one of the subcategories. So I thought the visual would help here. When we talk about elder abuse, we're talking about abuse, neglect, and exploitation as the three big categories. And then under each one of those big categories, there are additional subcategories. So abuse can be broken down to physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional or psychological, and sexual abuse. Neglect is usually broken down into just two ways: caregiver neglect and self-neglect. And then exploitation, which is a fancy word for stealing. Exploitation really just has the one, although many people could argue that we can break that down into scams, fraud, identity theft, and just financial exploitation by a trusted family member or someone that knows us, that there's a lot of different ways that exploitation can come about. Okay, so now we're going to break down each one of those big categories and talk about these a little bit more in depth. So physical abuse is when an elder adult experiences illness, pain, injury, impairment, distress, or death as a result of the intentional use of force and acts such as hitting, kicking, and you see those listed here. I don't think any of these will surprise you. Slapping, punching, pinching, using water in the shower maybe that's too hot or too cold, not necessarily something that people would automatically think would be considered abuse, but it certainly is. You know, ranging anywhere from just being too uncomfortable to bear, being in too cold of water just to make someone feel uncomfortable or to leverage that power over them, all the way up to using hot water that's so hot that it scalds them and leaves burns. And both of those have been reported. Signs of physical abuse, as you would certainly imagine, and you know, this is review for many of you, but just to be, you know, making sure we're all on the same page here. Bruises, often we think of bruises. If you think of the bruises that you receive, you run into a coffee table or you crash your elbow into a door jamb, you end up with bruises on your extremities, on your shins, on your forearm when you crash into things, or something somehow you end up with a bruise, but you don't often get bruises to the trunk of your body in a normal day of running through your house and being clumsy, maybe like I am. So bruises to the trunk, bruises to, of course, the genital area are indicators of sexual abuse. Bruises to the face, of course, indicate punching or slapping. Now, in a facility setting, I know that I was often pulled over by family members who would say, look at the bruising on that individual's face. Certainly someone has been abusing them. And in that case, the individual was someone who had taken a fall and they were on blood thinners. And they, of course, had that telltale bruising from, literally head to toe, but it was on one side of the body. And so, of course, that's to say that not all bruising is going to equate to abuse, of course. So we talk about bruising in terms of what is atypical bruising. And also when someone is evaluating like a sexual assault nurse or a forensic nurse or a physician is evaluating someone, they will see bruises that are at different levels or different stages of healing, which means that those bruises happened at different times. So that's another telltale. Others that are listed here, of course, you're not going to be surprised by any of those. Delayed medical care, I think, is one that we don't always think of, which could fit into more of a neglect pattern than abuse. But a lot of what we'll talk about today, as you'll see, crosses over things that could fit in more than just one category. So you'll see that the lines are not always clear cut. There's a pattern of hospitalization or using different hospitals, hospital hopping, so that one hospital doesn't notice all of the different injuries that a person has received. So these are some of the signs of physical abuse. Verbal abuse, any oral, written, or gestured language that includes disparaging or derogatory terms to the care recipient, or something that's even within their hearing distance. So someone who is outside the room of an individual at an assisted living home and two staff members are laughing and joking about that individual and making fun of them where they can hear them intentionally, or making threats of harm or yelling. Also, I mentioned earlier, leveraging power. When we use the if-then statements, if you don't stop hollering out, if you don't stop using the call bell, if you don't stop disturbing me, then I'm not going to bring you your pain medicine. I'm not going to bring you any dinner. I'm going to move your wheelchair to the other side of the room so you can't get up and move around. Those consequent statements where a person leverages their power over someone who is dependent, absolutely considered verbal abuse as well. Emotional and psychological abuse, and again, a lot of these overlap when we talk about verbal and verbal abuse, emotional and psychological abuse. There is a lot of overlap, but the emotional and psychological refers to both verbal and nonverbal behaviors that inflict anguish, worry, mental pain, fear, distress. It could be humiliation, disrespect. It could be a verbal threat, maybe making a fist and going like this with a threat of harm, harassment, and also isolating the individual. So there's a lot of ways that an individual can be emotionally abused that we might not think about. Signs of verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse. These are all lumped together because these have very similar symptoms or signs. Depression, withdrawal, tearfulness, unexplained fear, change in eating or sleeping patterns, isolation, signs of other types of abuse, because typically verbal abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse goes hand in hand with someone who is also physically abusing them or exploiting them. So again, these things don't happen typically in silos. They cross over, and there are usually multiple types of abuse happening. When there's one type, there's usually a couple of other types going on as well. Okay, let's talk about the one that most people consider the most heinous, and that's sexual abuse, which simply means, as you might imagine, touching, fondling, intercourse, or any other type of sexual activity where with an older adult, when the older adult is unable to understand what's happening, unwilling to consent to the sexual act, or they are threatened or physically forced to comply. It involves that forced, unwanted sexual interaction, and it may include sexual contact, sexual penetration, or non-contact acts such as sexual harassment. So keep in mind that sexual harassment is included here when we talk about sexual abuse. And it's important to note there that it includes sexual interactions with individuals who have cognitive disabilities that prevent them from being able to give consent, that's still considered, or that is considered sexual abuse. If the individual cannot consent, then that is considered sexual abuse. Signs of sexual abuse among elders is similar to signs of abuse among anyone of any age, although you might see some exacerbated bruising or skin tears, of course, but pelvic injury, problems walking, problems sitting, bruising to the genitals or inner thighs, newly sexually transmitted diseases or infections, and pain in the genitals or the anus. I don't have bleeding on here, but of course, bleeding, bloody bed linens, bloody clothes or underwear would also be a sign. I need to add that one in there. Moving on, let's jump to neglect and talk about neglect. Neglect is different from abuse in that abuse is a willful, intentional harm to someone. Neglect is I'm going to withhold something in order to cause harm. So it's almost abuse is doing something to cause harm. Neglect is not doing something with the same goal, is to cause harm. So let's look at that a little bit more deeply. In North Carolina, the law, the neglect definition is when we have a disabled adult who's either living alone or they're not able to provide for himself or herself the services necessary to maintain the person's physical or mental health, or they're not receiving services from their caretaker or caregiver. So this one is, at first it's explaining what we call self-neglect, and then the end of that sentence there, not receiving services from the person's caretaker, is referencing caregiver neglect. In general, neglect is, I'm jumping back up to the top, I'm moving around on you, but neglect is the failure to meet an older adult's basic needs. And this includes food, water, shelter, clothing, hygiene, medication, medical care, any of the things that someone really must have to maintain their health. This is what we're talking about. And then we divide it down into whether self-neglect is, or whether the neglect is self-inflicted neglect or it's caregiver-inflicted neglect. This is the best way that I like to look at this and understand it. As we compare self-neglect to caregiver neglect, self-neglect might be someone who has developed some cognitive decline and they're wandering in their yard or in their neighborhood and they get lost. By contrast, look at that first one under caregiver neglect, and that would be the failure to provide the supervision that individual needs so that they don't get lost in their neighborhood and wander by themselves. Maybe instead of allowing them to wander where they might get lost, maybe we go for a walk instead so they can get their exercise and burn up some of the energy that they might have going for a walk, getting some fresh air and some sunshine. But when we, as a caregiver, allow them to go out without supervision, knowing that they've gotten lost before, that might be where caregiver neglect comes into play. Self-neglect, forgetfulness in paying bills, turning off the stove, gas, lights. Whereas caregiver neglect, by contrast, is the failure to manage the resources, failure to pay the bill, to make sure that the power stays on, to make sure that the individual has running water in their home. So that would be that difference. So hopefully that paints a picture that the outcome is often the same, but the reasoning behind the neglect is different. And sometimes caregiver neglect is not out of a caregiver intending harm, but it's more the caregiver is overwhelmed, they're exhausted, they don't know how to respond to someone who is hitting them without hitting back. So sometimes it's education and training for that caregiver. So I mention that because I want you to think through that caregiver neglect sometimes is absolutely an intentional thing where the individual was so overwhelmed they forgot to pay bills this month and the power bill got cut off. Or they did it on purpose because they used all of that person's funds, maybe to purchase a new boat. So we've got exploitation, but also neglect from the caregiver to manage the resources correctly. So it could be intentional with malice, or it could be intentional simply because the caregiver is just not able, or able, I guess is the right word, due to maybe their own illness or just their own lack of education about what the person needs. Probably the best example I can give you there is a caregiver who doesn't know of the importance of turning someone who is bedbound to reduce the pressure on that individual, and they develop pressure ulcers or bed sores. That's a common caregiver neglect that sometimes can move into the caregiver is neglectful and they know about the bed sores and haven't done anything about it, but it also can be because the individual just simply didn't know that was part of the importance of keeping that individual healthy, and part of the steps in keeping someone from developing a bed sore. Signs of neglect, none of these will surprise you. Poor hygiene, lack of food, medication, unexplained weight loss, untreated illness or injury, bed sores like we talked about, inadequate or unclean clothing. So all of those are things that might raise your eye. Some of them, if it's just one thing, might not be enough to really raise a red flag, but if you're seeing several of these, it certainly could be. Okay, next, jumping into exploitation. I told you earlier that the most basic definition of exploitation is stealing, but here's a little bit more laid out and a deeper dive. Financial abuse or exploitation is the illegal use or the improper use of a disabled adult or his resources for another profit or advantage. Elder exploitation is the most common type of self-reported elder abuse. So when elders are stolen from, they are more likely to report that than when they are physically abused or neglected. So that's important for us to stop and think about that as well. But back to that definition. One of the things that this talks about, the illegal or improper use of a disabled adult, what that's talking about is having that individual work for you for free, having that individual pull weeds in the yard as trade for having a dinner, having food. I'll get you groceries as long as you take care of cleaning this or folding this laundry, that you have to do your part. Now, if the individual wants to do those things, that's a different story, but making it where they have to, or using their items. I actually had some exposure to a case with an individual who was living in an assisted living, and the individual could not afford his cigarettes. So the facility actually said, if you take care of the lawn, and this was a pretty able-bodied, younger individual with disabilities, if you help take care of the lawn by pulling the weeds and putting down some mulch, then we will give you cigarettes because you can't afford to buy your cigarettes yourself. That is the improper use of a person. So it's important to know that it's not just stealing their resources, but it's also using them as a tool to get a job done. Indicators of exploitation. There's many of them here. I'm not going to read all of these to you. The ones that I always do like to touch base on: missing medication. When we take an older adult's medication and either use it for our own recreational drug purposes, or we take it and sell it to make money, that's considered drug diversion. And so missing medication can be a red flag for exploitation, especially if that individual is on painkillers and some of those opiate medications. Of course, pattern of missing belongings, property, cash. Isolation also happens in exploitation. Guardian or the power of attorney makes excuses about a change in the older adult's finances, doesn't pay the bills. Things start disappearing from the individual's home because their family is selling some of the valuables or selling things. I had a situation as well like this, where the individual had a pretty severe stroke and was not expected to make a recovery, and the family got started selling the it was farmland, so selling the tractors, the other farm equipment. The house was full of antique furniture, so all of that got sold. It got to the point where the house was up for sale, the vehicles had been sold, the car and the truck had been sold. When that individual had gotten unexpectedly improved and rehabilitated to the point where he was ready to come home, and he found out that his house was up for sale, his house was empty, and most of his farm equipment had been already sold, and the family had put the proceeds from all of those sales into their own bank account rather than into his bank account. And that absolutely fits that bill of exploitation. Even if someone has a power of attorney, they still can't use the older adult's funds for their benefit. They still have to keep those pots of money separate. And in this case, they were not doing that. They expected the individual to stay in the nursing home. They expected him to pass away and never know that they had already benefited from selling his belongings. Hopefully, you've had a chance to take to peruse some of these others as well. Another one that is not one that we would typically think about is maybe an unlicensed care home. Someone who has 3 or 4 older adults, maybe more, under their care, but they are not a licensed home. A lot of times we'll hear about that popping up, usually law enforcement and Adult Protective Services respond quickly to those. A lot of times you'll hear that these folks move often, that when Adult Protective Services or law enforcement start investigating, that the individuals get moved from the house to the hotel or motel down the street, and everybody stays in the hotel or motel until the investigation is closed, so that there's no evidence that that person is housing many different people without a business license, without having a license to operate a care home. And in the meantime, they are receiving those Social Security benefits usually for their own benefit, and they've had the individual sign over the Social Security benefit to them. So that's another one that we hear about from time to time. So if you have any suspicion that, or you hear about an unlicensed care home, it's important that you have that looked into as well. Okay, so going back to the idea that we have these three big categories and then multiple subcategories: abuse, neglect, exploitation, and then the several categories of abuse, 2 categories of neglect and exploitation. The next idea I want you to be able to leave here with today is that different types of abuse are co-occurring. When we have abuse, we may also have financial exploitation. When we have neglect, we might also have someone being isolated and verbally threatened. So these things I think I've already mentioned, but it bears repeating because it is important to know that very often we have multiple types of abuse co-occurring. And you may only see or know about one type when actually there are other things happening, and those come to light perhaps during the course of an investigation. Let's talk now, we're going to shift and talk about common characteristics of abuse victims. Now, abuse can happen to anyone, and I certainly don't mean to push stereotypes, but we certainly do know that there are some common risk factors. So that's what we're going over, but it is important to keep in the back of your head that even though you know the risk factors, that anyone at any time could be a victim of elder abuse. Folks who are abused, typically, the risk increases with age. More than half of victims are over age 80. Risk increases as dependence level increases. Risk is greater for females. About 2/3 are women. Risk increases for those who are physically or verbally aggressive towards others. So someone with cognitive deficit and behaviors can increase their risk of being mistreated themselves. 60% of victims show signs of some type of dementia or confusion. Abuse is reported less in rural communities. Over the past maybe 2 to 3 years, I've started seeing more and more of a focus on our rural communities because folks are more isolated, they have fewer services, and sometimes increased dementia in some of our rural communities. So as a result, we are starting to hear more and more research about abuse and the effect of abuse and the fact that it is reported so much less in our rural communities. Risk increases, of course, for those who have a history of domestic violence. And right here, I use that new term, intimate partner violence, or substance abuse. This should not surprise anyone. If you have a couple who has had the police have been called throughout the years. They have maybe a rocky marriage or a rocky partnership if they're not married. And they go from being in their 40s to their 50s and now in their 60s. Well, when they were 40s and 50s, it was considered domestic violence. Once they move into their 60s, that domestic violence, it still exists, but it's also called elder abuse at that point. So it's important just to think that that could be a shift that has been a pattern of behavior for years and years. I don't mean to jump into too many different stories from my past working as an ombudsman in long-term care facilities, but I will pause here and just throw in a little tidbit of a story or an example as far as a husband and wife couple who had a tumultuous couple or marriage for a long time. They grew into older adulthood and still had that same type of relationship where they would name call and yell and sometimes throw things at each other. And sometimes it would escalate into hitting. The wife would hit the male would hit the wife. It happened both back and forth. In that case, when they both moved into the nursing home setting. The male, I think, had moved in first, and the female moved in maybe a year later. In that case, they wanted to room together in the nursing home. And the nursing home already knew about their bumpy relationship, but they had to allow it at first, understanding that with their rocky history, they needed to keep a close eye on this couple, because if it became one of those arguments that escalated into throwing things, I think he hit her with his cane and yelling. All of those things are considered resident to resident abuse when you live in a nursing home setting. And the nursing home has its own set of laws where the nursing home has to keep individuals safe. It has to keep their residents safe from abuse or the threat of abuse. So they can't even allow a yelling to happen in front of other residents for fear that those other residents might start feeling that they are in danger themselves. So the couple themselves responded when they were talked about to this, and I was part of that conversation. They responded by saying, this is our way. This is our marriage. This is our way. This is how we've always dealt with everything. And we don't want you involved in this. This is between us. Just like we didn't want law enforcement coming to our home 20 years ago, we don't want you involved in this. And we had to explain that in this case, certainly they have a right to converse, but they don't have a right to raise that to a level of yelling, screaming where it disturbs other people. And we had to have that conversation where you do have some rights, but you don't have a right. Your rights have to be balanced with responsibilities in the nursing home setting. And when you live in a community setting, you have to balance your rights against the rights of the many who live around you. So another interesting little tidbit that I thought would be worth mentioning here in this case. Trying to think if there's any others that we need to touch base on. It's estimated that 50% of individuals who have dementia have been mistreated by their caregivers. Now, mistreated could mean any of the things we've talked about today, right? So it could mean hitting, punching, pinching. It could mean that they have been talked to in a negative way or threatened, or something that we don't equate to as bad as being physically abused. Let's see. Now let's talk about, we talked about who are the characteristic victims. Let's talk about who are the characteristic abusers. Again, it's not always going to fall into this, but research does tell us that there certainly are some patterns. 60 to 80% of abusers are family members. I think the media would tend to lead us to believe that most abuse happens in the nursing home, assisted living, or hospital setting, when in fact, 60 to 80% of abuse happens by family members, and usually in the home setting. Happens to men and women It is, the abusers are men and women about equally, 52 to 48%. So it's not one sex over the other. As far as the gender differences, it's about equal there. We've already talked about how domestic abuse ages into elder abuse. 1/3 of the abusers are seniors themselves. I believe that's linked to that domestic abuse, aging into elder abuse, but it doesn't have to be that. You know, it could be something different. Often dependent on the older person for housing, finances, or other needs. So the individual who is abusing is dependent on the person that they are living with. And the older person is dependent on them for care or help with groceries or help with yard maintenance. So a lot of times you'll see a codependence. Usually the younger person needs the financial support and the older person needs the physical support. Inadequately treated mental health or substance abuse problems, again, no surprise there, or caregivers who feel stressed or burdened or simply have not been educated about proper caregiving techniques. Next, we're going to move into reporting abuse, and I'm going to keep us moving so that we can cover all this and then have time for questions. So in North Carolina, we talk about the mandatory reporter. North Carolina is considered a mandatory report state. So what I will share with you is that in North Carolina, you don't have a choice about reporting adult abuse. You are required by law to report it if you have a reasonable suspicion that an individual who is dependent or disabled is being abused, neglected, or exploited. All those things we've talked about today. You are required to report that to authorities. So that is why we report, because it's the law. It's also the right thing to do. You might save their life. And let's talk about who to call, when to call, and what information you'll need. I've got a little picture there of our Blow the Whistle on Elder Abuse brochure, and I have one here too. This is a little trifold or quadfold. It actually is a quadfold, but what it has in it is the names and numbers of the Adult Protective Services, which is who you call, across the 9-county region that my agency serves. There is also information later in this PowerPoint that gives you a place to click that gives you all 100 counties in North Carolina. It gives you the Adult Protective Services place to call across all 100 counties. When to call, you call as soon as possible when you have a reasonable expectation or a reasonable suspicion that someone is being abused, mistreated, exploited, etc. The information that you'll need, you need to gather as much information as you can without opening your own investigation. It is not your job to investigate. So there may be some things when you talk to Adult Protective Services and do that intake phone call that you don't know, and that's okay. But you want to try to have as much information as you can. The name of the individual, their age, the name of the person or who the person is that's doing the mistreating. Where do they live? If it's in a nursing home, what's the name of the nursing home? If they live in a community, what's the address? If you don't know the address, then you know the street number and you know that it's the yellow house and it's the third one on the right. You give as much information as you can, but you don't have to go and open your own investigation to collect the information. When we talk about reporting abuse, and I've already talked about the mandatory reporting, and here it is actually written in the law. This is from the general statutes, the North Carolina law, general statutes. Any person who has a reasonable cause to believe that a disabled adult is in need of services to protect the adult from abuse, neglect, or exploitation must file a report with the County Department of Social Services. Reports need to be made to the social services agency in the county where the adult either resides or is present. So maybe they're visiting from Florida, and right now they're staying with a neighbor, you still call, because right now they are present in North Carolina, and we still have that obligation to look into whether or not they are in need of protection. As far as mandatory reporting, a couple of little tidbits here. The only exception as far as who is a mandatory reporter is the Ombudsman Program. And those of you who are familiar with the Ombudsman Program, it shouldn't surprise you when you think about the Ombudsman Program advocates for long-term care residents. And we as the Ombudsman Program only take action with the consent of the resident. So the resident has to give the ombudsman consent to help them make a report to Adult Protective Services. So they can only report with the consent of the resident or with permission from the state ombudsman in cases where the resident is unable to consent. There is a bookmark link here to the reporting of elder abuse from the UNC School of Government, and it's a terrific guide on how to report across different disciplines. So if you work at a nursing home, it'll talk about that, versus if you work as a physical therapist in a therapy office, like a clinician's office, versus if you are a physician, or if you are a social worker working in a community setting. So it talks about it from the point of view of different disciplines. So it's a great resource. And there is finally that information where to contact on all 100 counties as well. Reporting is required when we're talking about physicians, hospitals, and medical facilities. Reporting is required when a healthcare provider treats a person who has a wound, injury, illness that arises from the discharge of a gun or a firearm. And the report must be made as soon as practicable to law enforcement within or the police within a municipality. I need to rewrite that. I have a typo there, sorry. Or if it's if you're within a municipality that has a police department, if not, then the sheriff within that county. So just know that there is a specific reference in the law for physicians, hospitals, and medical facilities where they have to report if it's a criminal act of violence. Okay, one of the other things that's important when we talk about reporting abuse and looking at why an abuse report either does get investigated or does not get investigated, one of the most important things that we think of is whether or not that individual meets the definition of disabled adult. So this again comes from our general statutes. The term disabled adult is defined to mean a person 18 or older, or any lawfully emancipated minor who is present in North Carolina and is physically or mentally incapacitated due to, and the list is long there, it includes intellectual disability, and then it goes on cerebral palsy, epilepsy, organic brain damage caused by advanced age, physical degeneration, or conditions incurred at any age, which are the result of an accident, brain damage, mental, physical illness, or consumption or absorption of substances. So that is the official definition of disabled adult. And the reason that that is so important is if the individual does not meet the definition of disabled adult, that call to Adult Protective Services or to law enforcement may not go in the way that you would expect it might go. So abuse in North Carolina, and this is looking at several of the different tenets that Adult Protective Services has to adhere to. They've got a lot of laws that bind them. So we already talked about the definition of disabled adult, right? We've got to meet that for that referral or call to them to be screened in. It's also important to know the adult must be unable to perform or obtain essential services because of his or her mental incapacity, or there's no able, responsible caregiver or willing person to help them obtain essential services. So if the essential services are not happening either because the individual can't do them themselves, or they don't have a caregiver to help them do them for them, those are important requirements. Also, the adults who have capacity, they can refuse services completely and tell Adult Protective Services, I am aware that my home is the way that it is. I understand that you think that this is a self-neglect situation. I choose to live this way. I have the right to live this way. Thank you very much, but no, I don't want any services from Adult Protective Services. And they are allowed to say that if they are deemed to have the capacity. They are allowed, just like you and I are allowed, to make bad choices. Adults who have capacity and they get a call and they're called in as part of an Adult Protective Services report, they have the right to refuse services, or they can start services with the social services department and then later withdraw the consent for services. So they can either not start it at all, or they can get started with them and then decide that they don't want to continue and stop the services. It is also important to know that a DSS's authority extends to abuse, neglect, and exploitation. For exploitation, the perpetrator can be anyone, okay? For abuse or neglect specifically, DSS has authority to act only if the alleged perpetrator is the disabled adult's caretaker or if it's a case of self-neglect. We might have some questions about that, and we can also certainly come back to that. I'm gonna move us on, but it's important to know these are some of the big tenets that are requirements for every single Department of Social Services, APS, Adult Protective Services unit. They have to follow every one of these. So a lot of times our APS units will get a bad rap because they don't look into something. And usually it's because there's a criteria in here that's not met. So it's so important that we understand what those criteria are, so we understand when I call in to make a report, I might understand already that this person has capacity to make a bad decision. So they might not accept the help, but I'm going to do my due diligence and call it in anyway, because I think that this person may need help. So we can talk about that a little bit more as we move along. For those of you who work in a setting where you work with clients and do maybe an intake or an assessment for those individuals, I think it's important that we have all talked and discussed some of the steps that can be taken to help screen for elder mistreatment. One of the suggestions is to incorporate standard questions about abuse upon every single intake and admission. And to do that, we use formalized questions, so we minimize that stigma and encourage disclosure, and we let them know there's no judgment here. We always interview the client alone, even if the family or friend who is with them seems good, even if they say, oh, this is my daughter and she's just an angel and she can stay. We still need to do the assessment the right way and interview the person alone. Now, after we screen them, of course, bring that daughter right back in. And the individual can say, these are the things they were asking me, but we want to be sure that we're giving them every opportunity to answer openly and honestly, and they may not do that if there's any mistreatment happening. Lastly, advise the client whether confidentiality or privilege apply to your conversation. and whether you are a mandated reporter. If someone reports to you that they are being mistreated, there's going to be a line of next steps that are going to happen. So make sure that they know and that they're aware of what's going to happen in that case. Be transparent with your client so that they can make an informed decision about what they're willing to share with you or not. Some of the sample questions to ask, and I actually added on here down at the bottom left of your screen. It is a little handout, and I actually printed it out so that I remembered to mention it to you. But this is called the Elder Abuse Screening Tool for Healthcare Professionals, and I find it to be pretty comprehensive. The link is there so you know where to find it. The NCEA is probably my most cited source throughout anything that I do on elder abuse education. NCEA is the National Center on Elder Abuse, and I find that they have the absolute top-notch resources, handouts, pamphlets. They really do have just about anything from an elder abuse standpoint. If you're wanting to read more about the difference between competency and capacity, if you want to learn more about self-neglect, this is the place to go to. They really do have tons and tons of great information. But there are some listed screening questions. Some of the most basic ones I listed here, but again, this research to practice link here gives you actually 3 different tools that have been in use for about 10 years, I would say. And it's probably the 3 most popular ones. So you could take those and look at all of them and kind of decide what screening tools that you or your agency wanted to adopt, if any. But I thought I would include that as a helpful resource. Are you afraid of anyone is an important question that all people should be asked. I know anytime I've been in the hospital, I always get that question. And my family members are asked to leave, and I'm answering that question without anyone else around. Who makes decisions about your life, such as where you should live, or who you talk to, or how you spend your finances? Who makes your financial decisions? How is that working for you? Also screen for physical or sexual abuse. Have you ever been touched by someone in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable? Have you ever been physically harmed by someone? So all these pointed, direct questions are important for a good screening. How to respond. Perhaps the most important thing that we can do is respond correctly and appropriately if someone trusts us enough to share with us that they have been mistreated. The way that we respond is to affirm that they have a right to be safe and that their safety is your first concern. Secondly, we want to reassure them that the abuse or mistreatment is not their fault. We want to listen without judging, listen with empathy. And then we want to help that individual connect to some type of resources: adult protective services, domestic violence, sexual assault, abuse advocate. There are many different ways or agencies that they could be put in touch with. And they may not feel comfortable at that point making that call themselves. You might be the very first person that they have ever shared this information with, and they might be having a tough time getting through it and finding the words. And in that case, you can help them by making the phone call for them and being there at their side to let them know you're going to help them however they need. Okay, we talked about raising awareness earlier and why the awareness is so important. This is a quote from one of my most favorite elder abuse educators. She works at the National Center on Elder Abuse. She is a physician as well as a professor at the university, the Keck School of Medicine at USC. But I love this quote. We as a nation must act upon a commitment to value our elders, whether they are vigorous or frail, lucid or demented, independent or in need of a helping hand. After all, it's what we want for our grandparents, our parents, and ourselves. And when we talk about increasing awareness, there are so many folks who just don't know that there is a mandatory reporting law, or what abuse looks like, or that abuse includes verbal abuse, yelling, threatening, frightening an older adult. So all of those things, we need to raise the bar and raise the awareness of abuse. So I've listed a few ways to raise awareness here. Share the knowledge, host an educational presentation at your workplace, church, civic community, civic organization. Share information on your social media. A lot of times I'll see a post from the NCEA and I'll just hit the share button, and then it's on my Facebook account where I'm sharing that as well. You know, don't need to recreate the wheel. We just need to pass along the information to share it. Working to change attitudes towards the elderly by educating folks on the value of our elders. Introducing younger generations to older adults goes a long way to help with reducing some of that ageist attitude. Supporting caregivers, offering to help a neighbor who is a caregiver, make them a meal, picking up groceries, that type of thing. If you are a caregiver or you know one, watch out for signs of burnout. Watch out for signs that they need some education or some training, or just some support. If you suspect something may be wrong and it's someone that you know, ask them, reach out. If it's your neighbor, ask them, are you okay? You seem upset after your son left the other day, you seemed upset. Ask them if they're okay. It may have been that they just received a little bit of bad news, but it also could have been something much worse, that they need a little bit more support and they're not quite sure where to turn. And then lastly, participate in World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. There's a World Elder Abuse Awareness Day toolkit. And there's a link there, I think, and it is a live link that's on the PowerPoint once you get the PowerPoint as well. There's a couple of the sources that I use, some of my favorites. And then we have a case scenario, and then we'll do questions. And Caitlin, I believe, can bring up the case scenario for me. Hopefully, Caitlin, are you still there? I'm actually not seeing her on the call. Okay. She said her Zoom just crashed. I'm sorry. She did text me and told me her Zoom crashed. So I'm glad I didn't lose you guys. Hopefully you guys are still there. So Caitlin was going to bring up the case scenario, but just for the time, because I don't have it pulled up on my computer, what I'm going to do is just read this case scenario. It is a little bit long, but there's a reason for it being long. And then after, I'm going to ask you a couple questions. I'm going to ask you, what type of abuse do you see occurring in this scenario? Does this situation need to be reported to APS? If not, what do we need to do? What action do we need to take? I want you to think about what is our individual's name that we're going to talk about is Charlie. I want you to think about what is important to Charlie, what is important for Charlie, and what referrals you might make. So I know you guys have already listened to me for a long time, but I did want us to finish up by doing a case scenario. So we'll just do a case scenario. We'll just go over this one. I had a couple of others, but I think this one, it's lengthy. So we'll just do this one. And then in the chat, if you will, because I'm not sure if Caitlin's going to make it back on or not, but in the chat, which I'm not reading while I'm talking, but I will pull it up in just a minute. And we can kind of go through as well with information that you guys put in the chat, things that occur to you as we go through this scenario. Okay, Charlie is a 78-year-old male. He was hospitalized for dehydration, malnutrition, and diabetes mismanagement. So he's not compliant with his diabetes. He lives with his wife, who has advanced dementia, and Charlie is the primary caregiver. Their daughter lives in town and she tries to help, but she's busy with her work and raising 2 young children as a single parent. He doesn't want her to lose her job, so he tries not to bother her. They have a neighbor who will help supervise his wife for short periods of time, but only in the mornings and early afternoon, because the wife tends to wander and gets restless and fussy as we get closer to dinner time. The assessment at the hospital reveals bruises of varying stages on Charlie's torso and his arms. But Charlie says he doesn't remember how he got the bruises. The hospital staff consider possible self or caregiver neglect and physical abuse based on the number of bruises and his malnourished state. He's worried about getting home quickly and grows impatient that his tests and treatments are not occurring faster in the hospital. He threatens to leave against medical advice if he doesn't get discharged soon, explaining he absolutely cannot leave his wife alone during the afternoon and evening because that's when she's most confused. He doesn't want to upset his neighbor for leaving her in his care for too long because he worries that she won't help him anymore. He denies being abused by anyone. He states that he's always been skinny and shares that he has no appetite at all and he has to force himself to eat a little bit. And everyone tells him he has to eat better for his diabetes management, but he just can't figure out all the things with the diabetes when he's got to focus on his wife. He normally has coffee for breakfast and he might eat 1 or 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or whatever food his daughter brings by. He keeps hot dogs and cans of soup on hand, and he makes those sometimes. He says what he eats doesn't matter. The focus needs to be on his wife and not him. He states he checks his blood sugars when he feels bad, but that doesn't happen often. He couldn't recall the last time he needed to use his insulin. He does make sure his wife gets medication twice per day, and he listed the name and dosage of her 4 prescription medications and 1 vitamin. He says he used to go see his primary doctor regularly, but he hasn't been back to the doctor in 2 years since his wife got so bad. Socially, he seems isolated and lonely, other than weekly visits from his daughter and an occasional help from his neighbor. He used to attend the Catholic church near his home and misses the friendships and support from his old church family. He admits caregiving for his wife is becoming increasingly difficult, but he promised her he would never put her in a home. Okay, that was a lot. I'm going to stop sharing and see if I can pull up the chat and go through the chat without my fearless partner, Caitlin, on the call. And I know she's probably trying to get back in. So what are your thoughts about Charlie? What type of abuse might be occurring here? Do you think it's that he's being physically abused? Lisa Wallace commented that it sounds like a lot of situations we see every day. Other people are saying no, 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 and self-neglect is mentioned. Possibly physical neglect, definitely self-neglect, no abuse, but he needs support for himself. Where do you think the bruises are coming from then? His wife, yeah. That's what I was thinking, that his wife is probably the one that's causing the bruises in the time that he gets up, in the times that she's having some of her most confused times. Yeah. Now he doesn't say anything about the fact that his wife is that her behaviors escalate to a point of physical abuse. but yeah, trying to restrain the wife. And it could just be in the course of trying to help her get bathed, trying to help her take Medicaid, trying to help her get dressed, certainly could result in that. Absolutely. Does this case need to be reported to Adult Protective Services? I get mixed answers here. Some say no, some say yes. Jesse Granger mentioned, yes, I would report to ensure safety for all. So I guess I'm not going to say that it should or shouldn't, I guess. I'll tell you that in the abuse circles, that what we always hear is, when in doubt, report, report, report. So if there's even a bit of a suspicion, that it needs to be reported. Now, Bertha Darden just mentioned he is overwhelmed. Absolutely, he is an overwhelmed caregiver. So I'm looking to see help try to get the daughter to try to help engage the daughter more. Support is needed. Adult Protective Services may be able to initiate those services. Absolutely. Meals on Wheels for the couple to help them maybe get a more balanced nutrition and diet in there. Absolutely. Maybe some possible respite care could help. Absolutely. That's a great idea. In addition to reporting, let's see, you can always provide additional information on how to help Charlie in the short term. Absolutely. That's a great point, Jesse. So we want to give that individual resources. I have a suspicion that if we gave Charlie a list of phone numbers, he might not call. I wonder if we could go a step further and call for him, if he might be more receptive to that. Anything when someone is overwhelmed as a caregiver, anything, I guess at least my take, any steps I can take to help ease their burden at the time when they are most overwhelmed, I think is beneficial to help those services get started. Because if we leave it for him, he might think, I'm going to call, but I'm not going to call this week because it's just a tough week. He might wait 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, and that's too long. We want to get that help in there more quickly. What is important to Charlie? This is always one of my favorite questions, to talk about what's important to someone and what's important for someone. His wife, absolutely. His wife not going to a nursing home, his wife getting the care she deserves and receives. Absolutely. Jesse mentioned that reducing the size of that list of referral sources can also help. Just give a couple, just give those top 3, get started there. Maybe we can pull in some more later. That's a great point, Jesse. But absolutely, I agree with you. Charlie's not overly concerned with himself. He doesn't want the focus to be on him. He wants to get back to his wife, and he seems extraordinarily devoted to her. She needs the most support so he can focus on himself. Absolutely. What's important for Charlie? We know his wife is what's important to him. Yeah. So we shift when we talk about what's important for him, then we start being the ones looking out for him, thinking, what's important for this individual? Absolutely. Bertha, you raise a good point. Is it love or is he afraid? In some situations, I know that there has been a spouse who has promised to another spouse, I will never put you in a home. But when dementia behaviors become so great that they cannot do what they need to do, and it affects their health, or it affects their safety, sometimes that promise may change. Hopefully in Charlie's case, it won't need to. But yeah, is it love or is he afraid? Have we moved past the point that that we're going to continue to honor his promise to his wife, and look to APS to step in and maybe take some action in that way. I'm not saying that's the right thing. I'm saying that that's just out there in that swirl of choices. But you guys are hitting the nail on the head on all of these things. And lastly, I think we've already talked about what referrals that you might make. Alzheimer's Association support group, Meals on Wheels, in-home aid services, transportation, maybe group respite to give him, or adult daycare to give him some time to take care of himself, maybe go to the grocery store, buy something more healthy than peanut butter and jelly, maybe, maybe go to his own doctor's appointment or meet with a nutritionist about what he could be eating to keep himself healthy, and maybe turn it around where we say, we know you don't care about watching yourself, taking care of yourself, but you're going to be able to take care of your wife better and longer if you take care of yourself and do these things, and put it into that time, that frame of mind for him. But yes, his diabetes needs to be managed. That is going to cause him more and more trouble. Referral to neurology or psychiatric eval for his wife. Maybe something can be done with those difficult behaviors to help modify some of those behaviors that she's having, so that things get a little easier for both of them. Because I imagine if her behaviors are running that high and getting that escalated, she's probably in need of some relief too. Trying to help him engage with his church friends, if available, maybe pull in some help from the community. Absolutely. There's a great statement here. If you want to care for your wife and keep your promise, you have to care for yourself. Otherwise, she will have to seek alternative care if you're unable to care for her. And that's an important message for caregivers who are wearing themselves out and not taking care of themselves. Possibly, maybe he could take a Building Better Caregivers course and really learn how to take better care of himself in the process. Okay, well, thank you guys for participating with that little case about Charlie. I thought that would be interesting to pull in and also help us just think through. Abuse cases are not a one and done. In most cases, it is complex. There are multiple things happening. There are other family members in there. There are obligations that we don't know about sometimes. There are finances that play a role in absolutely everything. So looking at this and hearing your thoughts and your suggestions, I love all the feedback. I wish that we could, I should have asked to set it up not as a webinar so we could have talked about that instead of having you guys all put it in the chat. But I appreciate you guys taking the time to put it in the chat and for us to go through it in that way. So we have like 2 minutes left. Does anyone have any burning questions or anything before we finish up? I thought we might even finish early, but I appreciate everyone being here again and taking the time to hear about a tough subject. As I'm finishing up, let me know if there's ever anything I can do to help you answer questions, turn you to some resource information. My email, let me put my email in the chat just in case anybody, I don't know if I've had that listed anywhere or not. So let me make sure you guys have that if you need it. Again, thank you for being here. And if there aren't any last questions, I know you guys, I'm standing. Oh, there's a question. As far as mandated support, does that include those who are not healthcare professionals? Oh, mandated reporters. Does that include those who are not healthcare professionals, but friends and family? Yes. The mandated reporter applies to everyone in North Carolina. Unless you've been told that you're not a mandated reporter, you can safely assume that you are. Any other questions before we close out? Evelyn, you're a CAC member. I knew I recognized your name from somewhere. I'm not seeing any other names. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and I will close this out and appreciate you being here. And like Caitlin had mentioned earlier, she will make sure that everybody gets a follow-up, I think, survey and a attendance certificate of attendance. So holler at us if we can ever be of service to you, and thanks again for being here.